We'll start. Welcome. My name is Tom Keenan. I teach... Is the mic on? Okay. I teach literature and human rights at Bard College, and I direct the human rights program there. It's a great pleasure to be co-moderating this panel with my friend and sometimes colleague and collaborator, Lynn Tillman. And welcome to the Penn Festival. We're going to talk about writing, resistance, record keeping, speaking out today, particularly in the context of torture at Guantánamo, with four really distinguished panelists who I'll introduce quickly, and then Lynn will have some other opening remarks. At the far end is Larry Seams, who's a writer and director of the Freedom to Write and international programs at the Penn American Center. He's the author of The Torture Report, What the Documents Say About America's Post-9/11 Torture Program, which is kind of a textbook in a way for this panel today. He's also working these days on the Reckoning with Torture film project, which is a joint enterprise of Penn, the ACLU, and Doug Lyman, the director, and we'll see a little bit of that in a moment. In the middle is David Frakt, who's visiting professor of law at the Pittsburgh Law School and a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. He was a military attorney in the JAG Corps, and in 2008 he volunteered to be a military defense lawyer. One of his clients was Mohammed Jawad, who became quite a celebrated case, which we'll be looking at a bit today. Next to me is Alberto Mora, who's today Vice President, Secretary, and General Counsel of Mars Incorporated, has a long diplomatic and military career. He was General Counsel of the Navy in the Bush administration, and in 2004, author of a very important memo which attempted to record, document, and bring an end to systematic abuses at American military and intelligence facilities. Next to Larry on the end is Aleksandar Hemon, novelist originally from Sarajevo, and author of The Question of Bruno, Nowhere Man, The Lazarus Project, and Love and Obstacles. He's received a Guggenheim and a MacArthur, among other awards. So it's a very distinguished panel, and we're looking forward to a good conversation here.
I'm speaking as a writer. Both Aleksandar Hemon and I are writers, fiction and nonfiction writers, and I'm also a trustee of Penn. I wanted to think about the verb resist and to resist. I want to think of it in its lowercase and ordinary sense. It's difficult to resist and separate from the group and say, no, I won't, it's wrong, I can't. Many of us try, back down, can't, or won't. Showing difference in a group, objecting in small ways to a sister, a boss, or a best friend, deciding when to speak up, when it's worth it to lose a friend. These are small instances of objection and resistance in daily life. Up close, personal, to resist requires, I don't know, resolve, character, being fed up, and I suppose having courage. Or being able to take a risk. Many of us are afraid to risk what we have, or don't know we don't take risks. Don't question ourselves in that sense. I'm not saying this self-righteously. I don't go on protest marches. I'm afraid I'll suffocate or be trampled upon. Yes, I sign petitions, I send money, but I despair of feeling like a goody-goody. And I appreciate Virginia Woolf, who wrote in her diary, "Why should the right pursuits be so entirely hideous?" By using the law when laws were and are being broken, David Frakt and Alberto Mora resisted the United States government and its use of torture. They have objected to imprisoning men for years and years without credible evidence of their guilt, and they're here today to talk about it. Maybe they're heroes or heroic, maybe they should be called that, but I don't want to make them into larger-than-life figures. If I do, then they live in a different world from me, and I am exempt from the questions they ask themselves. I want to think of them as people who acted out of conscience and responsibility, who weren't impulsive, and knew what they were doing, who made human decisions about human-created behaviors. By saying that they are people like us, not superheroes flying across the sky in weird costumes, I can also admit their example asks, how would I do it? What would I do? Would I do it? If I think of them as heroes, then I can't imagine myself playing in the same human ballpark or human league. That's the problem with calling people heroes. It exempts regular mortals from imagining themselves doing things differently, doing, for instance, what I ordinarily do. I think there's a continuum from standing up for oneself or a friend, objecting in your family, or the actions of your country, standing for the law or against bad laws. There is, in my mind, a continuum among these various stances and positions between the small and big moments and how one moves from one to another. There's a relationship also between courage and encourage. I believe that PEN encourages writers and thinkers and people globally to have courage because PEN has got their backs. Not all of us can travel to places where writers are endangered and tortured or can speak out and meet government leaders and object. So PEN represents us, stands up where we can't, in our names. I hope you will support PEN, join it. You need have published only one book, apply for a membership, anyone can. There is a membership committee eager for new members, or if you're not a writer, please donate to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. We'll start with Larry.
We'll just watch a little film clip quickly.
In the summer of 2007, a few months before I resigned as chief prosecutor for the military commissions at Guantánamo Bay, Lieutenant Colonel Darrel Vandeveld joined my staff, and I assigned him to the case of Mohammed Jawad. In 2008, Lieutenant Colonel Vandeveld, feeling an ethical conflict, removed himself from the case and provided a sworn statement to the ACLU as part of Mr. Jawad's habeas corpus petition. This is a portion of Lieutenant Colonel Vandeveld's sworn statement.
I, Darrel Vandeveld, declare as follows. I'm a Lieutenant Colonel in the Judge Advocate General Corps. Since the September 2001 attacks, I have served in Bosnia, Africa, Iraq, and Afghanistan. My awards include the Bronze Star Medal, the Iraqi Campaign Medal, and 2 Joint Meritorious Unit Awards. I offer this declaration in support of Mohammed Jawad's position for habeas corpus.
I was the lead prosecutor assigned to the military commissions case against Mr. Jawad until my resignation in September 2008. Initially, the case appeared to be a simple street crime as I had prosecuted by the dozens in my civilian life. But eventually, I began to harbor serious doubts about the strength of the evidence. Mr. Jawad was alleged to have thrown a grenade at U.S. troops, but the victims of the attack had not seen the attacker. At least 3 other Afghans had been arrested for the crime and had subsequently confessed, casting considerable doubt on the claim that Mr. Jawad was solely responsible for the attack.
And I learned that the written statement characterized as Jawad's personal confession could not possibly have been written by him because Jawad was functionally illiterate and could not read nor write. The statement was not even in his native language. I also found evidence that Mr. Jawad had been badly mistreated by U.S. authorities in both Afghanistan and Guantánamo. Mr. Jawad's prison records referred to a suicide attempt, a suicide which he sought to accomplish by banging his head repeatedly against one of his cell walls. The records reflected 112 unexplained moves from cell to cell over a 2-week period, an average of 8 moves per day for 14 days.
Mr. Jawad had been subjected to a sleep deprivation program known as the Frequent Flyer Program. I lack the words to express the heart sickness I experienced when I came to understand the pointless, purely gratuitous mistreatment of Mr. Jawad by my fellow soldiers. It is my opinion, based on my extensive knowledge of the case, that there is no credible evidence or legal basis to justify Mr. Jawad's detention in U.S. custody or his prosecution by military commission.
Holding Mr. Jawad for 6 years with no resolution of his case, with no terminus in sight, is something beyond a travesty.
That clip is from this Reckoning with Torture film project that Penn and the ACLU have been doing with Doug Lyman over the last couple of years, and it really is centered around these staged readings of the torture, the documentary record of torture. And the amazing thing about the record, and I think the reason we're here today, is the reason we have this record largely is because the story that we haven't heard enough of is how many people inside the military and how many people inside the intelligence agencies objected to what was happening. And as you're reading through these rather grim records of the way our country treated people, time and again you would come upon documents in which a single individual went on the record in an extremely brave and powerful way. We have with us David Frakt, who worked with Darrel Vandeveld. We hope to have Darrel Vandeveld with us today. Unfortunately, he was denied leave and not able to join us. He's working on a case in Washington. But I'm just going to turn this over to David, and David can tell us a little bit about the Jawad case and then this particular document and how it came to be.
Okay, thank you, Larry. I was Mohammed Jawad's defense counsel. I volunteered to go to Guantánamo and serve as a military defense counsel there. And Darrel Vandeveld was the prosecutor. And one of the first things I did was I sent a discovery request. I asked Darrel to turn over all the documents related to Mohammed's captivity, his detention, and what had happened to him. And the Guantánamo authorities had actually kept very good records. They had something called the Detainee Incident Management System, or DIMS, which captured everything that happened in the life of a detainee at Guantánamo. Every time they took a shower or refused to take a shower, took a meal, refused a meal, were visited by the chaplain or the ICRC or a psychologist, if they were shifted from one cell block to another for one reason or another. And so Darrel provided these records to me. He was the first prosecutor to turn over such records to a defense counsel. And actually when he did, he called me up and he said, "There's something you need to see in these." And what I found in there was the record that Mohammed had been subjected to this sleep deprivation program, which they euphemistically called the frequent flyer program. Now, what was surprising about this was that Mohammed Jawad was a teenage boy. He was not suspected of being involved in Al-Qaeda. He was the only person to be charged in the military commissions that was not charged with a crime of terrorism, with material support to terrorism, with conspiracy. He had been recognized by the intelligence folks at Guantánamo as having no intelligence value, as knowing nothing. So what they thought he was a low-level foot soldier who had thrown a hand grenade that had injured 2 U.S. soldiers. Subsequently, the evidence of that was cast into doubt for some of the reasons that you just heard. His confession, it turned out, had been beaten out of him by the Afghan police, who had broken his nose, threatened to kill a member of his family. There was supposedly an eyewitness, but that eyewitness turned out to be not credible, to have, he insisted on a bribe for giving the story that the government wanted to hear. So the confessions actually ended up being suppressed by the military judge. He ruled that they were the product of torture and were inadmissible. And that left the government with very little evidence to work with. And Darrel Vandeveld was a prosecutor, and he was a prosecutor's prosecutor, but he believed in not simply prosecuting people, but in doing justice. And over time, he became convinced that this case was weak, that he probably couldn't prove it in court, and that even if he could, he wasn't sure it was a war crime, and even if it was a war crime, he wasn't sure this young boy deserved to be punished any more than he already had, and he felt very strongly about that the abuses that we had experienced, and the sleep deprivation was just one of several things that we had done to him, but it was the first one where we had a very clear documentary record of it in U.S. government documents. It wasn't just the detainee saying this is what happened. We had proof of it, and that was what made this so significant. He chose to resign his position, and to his credit, he didn't actually resign. He had volunteered for a 2-year tour, and he said, please let me finish my 2-year tour somewhere else. He didn't want to shirk his military duty, but he said, I cannot ethically continue as a prosecutor in the military commissions. He also was a lead counsel on the Binyam Mohammed case, another British subject who had been rendered to Morocco and tortured quite brutally. That case also fell apart when they realized that his confessions were the product of torture. So he saw a lot of things that were very disturbing. I became convinced that I could actually win this case at Guantánamo, but that wasn't going to result in Mohammed Jawad being released, because the Bush administration's view was that even if you were acquitted, you were still an enemy combatant and could be held for the duration of hostilities. So I filed a habeas corpus petition with the help of the ACLU, since I'd never practiced in a civilian court, only in the military, but they were very helpful, and we asked Darrel for help. We said, look, if you support this petition as this former prosecutor, that's going to be very powerful. And he prepared this document. We worked on it together, and he went well beyond simply focusing on Mohammed Jawad and the reasons that he should be released, and actually into the document is a very powerful indictment of the military commissions and of the way that we treated detainees more generally. And so that's why it became a very seminal document in the war on terror and the response to it. And so Darrel sends his regards and his regrets, and he and I became very good friends through this process. And actually he was so affected by it that he had been a career prosecutor, but he resigned from being a prosecutor and became a public defender. And he's now currently defending a soldier on a capital murder charges out in Washington State, and that's why he was not able to be here with us today. Thank you.
Another one of the seminal documents is, I think as Tom mentioned, a statement for the record that Alberto Mora wrote in 2004 describing events that happened in Guantánamo and in the Pentagon at the end of 2002 and 2003. Alberto, can you tell us a little bit about your story in that document, what it contains?
Happy to, Larry. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. This is an important event, and I'm glad to be participating in it. In November 2002, I was serving as General Counsel of the Department of the Navy. Among my activities were to supervise the work of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. Now, none of us in the Department of the Navy, even though Guantánamo is a naval base, had responsibilities or any kind of activity or really any knowledge about the detention operations in Guantánamo. We knew they were going on, but the actual interrogations, policies, and practices that were being conducted were ordered and then reported up by the military chain of command as opposed to the departmental chain of command. So Guantánamo would report to the Southcom commander in Miami, who would report to the Joint Staff, report then to the Secretary of Defense, and on to the President of the White House, but it did not come through the service chiefs, Secretary of the Navy, and as a consequence, I did not have involvement in those kinds of activities until in a separate a meeting on completely unrelated matters, the then director of the NCIS, who's a wonderful guy, came to me, took me apart, and said, look,
my guys, NCIS agents who are present in Guantánamo, were involved in the criminal investigative task force seeking to build prosecution cases against the detainees, have been telling me that they're hearing rumors of detainee abuse in Guantánamo. We haven't seen them, we haven't participated in those interrogation sessions, but the rumors are all over Guantánamo. Would you like to hear more? And my response was, if that's happening, I have to hear more, because it's potentially unlawful activity in Guantánamo, and I have a duty to investigate. Dave Brandt said, okay, we'll come back tomorrow and give you some of the details. And he came back with 4 or 5 of his NCIS agents, including the chief psychologist and 2 individuals who were stationed in Guantánamo and happened to be up in Washington, actually for the purpose of this meeting. And the NCIS team told me in detail about the accounts they were hearing from other interrogators, whether at the mess hall or the gyms or the beaches or in the barracks, that they were applying abusive interrogation tactics to the detainees. In the course of that meeting, David gave me fragments of interrogation transcripts which demonstrated that they were starting to abuse the prisoners. The transcripts didn't demonstrate any cruel treatment, but clearly abusive and degrading treatment was there. And that was coupled with the story of the NCIS interrogators who were telling me that what they had learned from other interrogators was that now abuse was being applied, potentially cruelty, and with the phenomenon known in the literature of interrogation, which is decades old, this evidenced the phenomenon known as forced creep or forced drift, where if interrogators are authorized the use of some force and then not controlled carefully, not trained, then very easily the force and the abuse levels will escalate up until and including the use of torture. This is what clearly seemed to be going on in Guantánamo. The NCIS agents made a compelling case that this was the situation. Myself and my other colleagues, who included the Navy JAG, Mike Lohr, one-star admiral, and then Colonel Kevin Sandcooler, who was the Marine Corps SJA, or chief lawyer. All of us were of the opinion that this was unlawful, contrary to our values, contrary to our national interest, potential political disaster, and a series of events and phenomena that, if it were to continue, could seriously impede our ability to prosecute the war on terror effectively. The following day, seeking to find out more about this, I called the Army General Counsel, who provided me with a copy of the Rumsfeld Memorandum, which approved the use of what was called in the memorandum counter-resistance interrogation techniques. And this included the sensory deprivation, waterboarding, detainee-specific phobia techniques, and a number of other interrogation techniques. And the memorandum contained no words of limitation. And words of limitation, by that I mean any instruction that you may apply these techniques, but only until the point that it reaches a level of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, at which point those responsible should abandon the use of any further interrogation going beyond that point. Those words were not found in the memorandum. And clearly, this memorandum authorized, on its face, just very clearly from just a cursory reading of it, what would be the application of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and even torture. This is how I got involved in this matter. And before turning it back to Larry, let me say one important thing about this. The debate is not about torture. Unfortunately, it's convenient to use the word torture as the verbal hook upon which to engage in the discussion. But as all of us who are American citizens, for that matter, anybody here who's a European would know, the legal standard is cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. The law of the United States prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and the jurisprudence, constitutional jurisprudence, prohibits cruel treatment. Geneva Conventions prohibits cruel treatment. The European law uniformly treats the application of cruelty as a criminal act. Torture is a higher, it's more severe application of torture, but we should be conscious that when we talk about this and when we talk about torture, the law and the human rights objective and our objective here on stage is not to prohibit only the application of torture. It is really to prohibit the application of all cruelty and to hold those who were engaged in this, who are engaged in this, or in the future may be engaged in this, accountable for the act of applying cruelty.
Just if you could briefly take us through from the moment that you discovered these things until about a month later when Secretary Rumsfeld actually withdrew the authorization to use those techniques. What did you do and how did that happen?
It's a long story, but I'll attempt to compress it. The day after receiving that Rumsfeld memorandum, I went and met with Jim Haynes, who was the Department of Defense General Counsel. So he was the attorney who actually wrote the memo that went to Rumsfeld and which Rumsfeld approved, granting Guantanamo the authority to apply those interrogation techniques. By the way, when I saw the memorandum, I thought it was a simple mistake. It never crossed my mind that anybody engaged in the approval of the memorandum actually wished to apply cruel treatment, much less torture, to the detainees. I thought that at the Department of Defense level and at the Rumsfeld level, they just simply missed the issues. And mind you, this is not long after 9/11. The mood in the Pentagon was always one of frenzied and purposeful activity, the fear and concern that other terrorist attack may strike the homeland at any given moment, the desire to protect Americans, and then consequently the desire to obtain the intelligence that would help us protect the United States. So there was a frenzy of activity, all desperate, seeking to protect the country effectively. But I felt that the memorandum was a simple mistake, that Jim Haynes, who worked round the clock every day after 9/11, on occasion would fall asleep at the wheel on the way home because of overwork, and had a 3 or 4 foot high stack of documents in his inbox every day, just simply didn't read the memorandum closely enough. And if he read it, he didn't think through the implications of those interrogation techniques as applied to detainees. And I thought that Rumsfeld, poor guy, he's got a document that's been approved by 4 or 5 levels of lawyers. So he's thinking, well, the lawyers approve it. Surely there can't be any problem. So he ticks it off, but then writes on the bottom margin, he says, well, I stand at my desk 8 to 10 hours a day. Why are they limited to standing 4 hours a day? I went to Jim and I said, look, this memorandum permits torture. He says, no, it doesn't. And I said, read more carefully. Then I engaged in almost an hour monologue walking through the memorandum, while very clearly, either individually, every individual interrogation technique or in combination, you could easily exceed the limits of torture, and it certainly constituted cruel treatment. I was certain that by the time I left Jim's office, he had a very large office, and it takes a while to walk from his desk to the exit. Before I got out the door, he'd be picking up the phone, calling Secretary Rumsfeld and saying, we made a mistake. We misanalyzed this. I gave you the wrong advice. We made the wrong decision. Let's reel it back. Well, I fly down to Miami for my Christmas vacation with my family, and I'm at home thinking problem solved. It never occurred to me that the problem had not been solved by that one meeting. But I'm in Miami. Dave Brandt calls me from Washington, says, he knew I'd spoken to Haynes. He says, the detainee abuse is still going on in Guantanamo. So it clearly became evident to me that this was not a simple mistake. It was still a gross mistake, but it had not been inadvertent. That people had consciously sought to apply those techniques, even knowing that the techniques constituted cruel treatment for the detainees. I went back to the Pentagon, started organizing this more. The JAG Corps and my other attorneys started analyzing the issues in much greater detail. Went back to Haynes with another meeting. It was another almost hour monologue. Discussed a lot of issues, including the impact of these kinds of tactics on our ability to maintain the alliance we needed to maintain. You know, how could Tony Blair, as an example, ally himself with us and aid and abet what would be criminal activity in his country, or Jose Maria Aznar in Spain, any other prime minister? We threatened to unravel the entire coalition on the war on terror through the insistence on applying what are in Europe illegal activities against detainees. So there were a series of very serious consequences, not only violations of American law, but violations of the laws of war, international law, human rights policies and principles, and then placing our allies into a very difficult situation. That meeting and a series of other meetings, because I had a lot of meetings then seeking to build a coalition within the Pentagon, didn't produce the effect. And Larry, now getting to your answer to the story, I called Jim Haynes back and I said, look, it's been several weeks that I've been talking about this issue and nothing's changed. The abuse is still being produced. I've written a memo, which I'm sending to you this morning in draft, and I will sign to you this afternoon, unless there's a reason for me not to sign it. But the memo essentially holds that the interrogation techniques constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, could lead to torture, all of this in violation of American law. Haynes called me back into his office and he said, look, we'll tell you the entire conversation, but fundamentally says, your words have had great impact. The secretary is considering rescinding the interrogation techniques. I said, well, that sounds good. He said, no, I know. You're thinking it's not good enough. Let me call you back. He called me back 2 hours later, said, good news, the secretary has rescinded the interrogation techniques. Great, I won't be signing out my memo. Then NCIS, within a couple of days, called me back and said the abuse at Guantánamo had stopped. So I felt good. I thought all of us in the Pentagon who had worked on this issue, and this is, as I mentioned, no way a solo affair, because every JAG, and I talked with all the senior JAGs, were exactly of the same mind as I was. We all were in this together. We saw the situation similarly. And then we thought the problem was solved until then Abu Ghraib 2 years later popped up, and then the rest of it. And then we knew that the problem had not been solved, either at the Pentagon or elsewhere, because in fact there was much broader involvement than we had suspected initially in the entire issue, and the approvals and the systematic nature of the cruelty in interrogations was much, much broader than those of us at the top of the legal chain in the Pentagon at that time had suspected.
Rumsfeld rescinded that memo on January 15th, 2003, I believe. When was Mohammed Jawad's treatment that you described taking place?
Yes, Mohammed was subjected to the frequent flyer program in May of 2004. The person who was in charge of that program testified at his pretrial hearing in Guantánamo that it had continued at least until April 2005 when he had left the island. I did want to mention, by the way, that there was a happy ending in the Mohammed Jawad story. We did win the case. He was ordered released, and he was repatriated to Afghanistan in August of 2009 after he had about 6.5 years at Guantánamo.
Tom?
Sasha, maybe you would let us hear your thoughts on this question from a slightly different perspective, I think.
Well, my perspective is different because I have no first-hand experience in any way related to cruel and unusual punishments or torture. I'm most fascinated and flattered to be here in this company, as those issues are necessarily theoretical to me. But as I was reading, I had been reading about this for years, and I've been reading, preparing for this panel. So I don't really have any answers to anything, but I have questions, so I'll just put them out so we can talk about it. One of them is, what is baffling to me is the logic of the whole approach. The FBI checked out of this enhanced interrogation business. They did not think that this is how it should work. It was not productive, and it was also, they understood there were legal problems. I remember hearing a talk by a former senior CIA leader who this was in '99, before 9/11, who presented to the audience in which I was present the ticking bomb scenario. That is, they caught our guy, they're taking him to undisclosed location. We have their guy. We need to get our guy before they do something to him. Do we torture? And there was a discussion in the audience, and a substantial portion of people said, no, we do not torture, and then another portion, also substantial, said, yeah, hell yeah, let's torture. And he dismissed this ticking bomb scenario as a false scenario in many ways, and said that A, it's unethical to do this, and B, it was unlikely to produce actionable intelligence, that is, that torturee would lie about it. So it was present in the intelligence community and in the history of interrogation in this country, at least from what I understand, that torturing is unethical, A, and even if it was, in other words, even if it was producing actionable intelligence, but then there was substantial evidence that it was not producing substantial actionable intelligence. So the question for me was, why would they keep doing this? What is the logic of this? A substantial effort was put into developing this program, continuing this program, covering up the program. So I have only hypothetical, theoretical suggestions, and I would like to hear what everyone else thinks about it. One of them is that in reading about these things, often people who resisted the whole concept of torture talked about torture violating or going against American values. And certainly there's a set of American values that torture goes against. Individual sovereignty, human rights, respect of human life and pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, and so on. But I would like to propose that there's a simultaneous set of American values that is dependent or contingent upon the notion that force and violence are the main, or at least the most efficient form of agency. So that, and you can see it all over, I don't have to, from gun control issues to the fact that we are more likely to invade a country than talk about it at this time, talk to it, to any number of American movies in which the guy with guns wins the argument, quite simply. So that in the whole story of torture, the recurring motif is that the word from DC or from the higher echelons was crank it up. If they're not yielding intelligence, crank it up. And even if there was no chance of they yielding intelligence, as in the case of Jawad, the logic of the whole process, which starts with this notion that force produces something necessarily, was crank it up. So at some point, this procedure became justifiable or justified itself by proceeding. At some point, this is what I think you mean by force drift. It just keeps going. As it keeps going forward, it gets worse. But then in the hope that the increased force, the increased violence would eventually produce something that would justify the whole process retroactively, as it were. Now, the concept opposed to force and violence as the main means of agency is not peace, I should make this clear in my mind, but rather democracy and law. Democracy not as a necessarily even political system, but rather a form of societal organization in which individual rights are sovereign and absolute and have to be respected regardless of the state of, whether we're in state of war or not. And also law, that is law as a contract that binds a society, limits the force drift in particular cases, but also in general cases, so that not all conflicts could be resolved by implying force and violence. So there's an arena, as it were, in which conflicts on a global and also on local level could be resolved through some sort of negotiation, argument, even if it gets heated at some point. So those are my thoughts and questions. I would like to hear what you think. Why did they keep going on with that, with the whole program? I don't know if you have the questions, but.
I have a thought on that. I believe that there were people within the administration who simply did not view the detainees and the people that we were capturing and suspected terrorists as human beings, or at least as human beings of equal value and equal worth to Americans. And I think there was both, I think we cannot ignore both the religious and racial component of this. Imagine, if you will, that we had been attacked on 9/11 not by Islamic extremists and Arabs, but by Norwegian Christian fundamentalists. Someone like the Norwegian who went crazy and shot up all those teenage kids.
Or Timothy McVeigh.
Or a Timothy McVeigh. I will tell you that we would not have taken those Norwegian Christian extremists and put them on an island that was intended to be beyond the reach of the law. We would not have tortured them because they would have been seen, at least by the people in positions of power, as fellow human beings, however flawed their thinking may have been. I just do not think it would have been possible or would have happened were it not for the fact that these were Muslims and they were Arabs or other Middle Eastern folks. So they there was a belief or there was a fear that there was another terrorist attack coming, and they were very, very determined to not allow that to happen on their watch. I think there was guilt, extreme guilt, for being asleep at the switch and for ignoring the warnings that could have prevented 9/11. And so they were willing to it was the ends justify the means, and they were willing to allow anything, even to sacrifice some innocent people, even to, they really didn't care about the people that had been captured as human beings. And that's ultimately what this boils down to. They knew, they're not stupid, they knew that torture probably wouldn't work, but it might work. Maybe they would get something. And they felt this incredible sense of urgency that allowed them to just cast aside their values or American values. And so that's really what I think. I think it is religious and racial bigotry that allowed this to happen.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I think I share some of the same views. Clearly, the 9/11 hijackers and terrorists were seen as individuals who had opted out of the human race, just simply through the savagery of what they had done. I was in Guantánamo when the second plane load of detainees came in, and the belief about their savagery extended to, you remember the jumpsuits and the blindfolds and the rest of it. On the flight over, these detainees were seen as individuals who, if they were given slightest inattention, they would seek to chew through a hydraulic line in the plane, bringing it crashing down unless extreme measures were taken. In Guantánamo, I remember seeing the clinic, and the belief was that if you left their arms free, they would take a syringe and plunge it in the eye of the doctor, because that's the kind of people they are, meaning not non-human. David's exactly right. There was a belief that among particularly those in CIA, in other words, who didn't really know the history of interrogation, weren't professionally trained in interrogation, that interrogation could be useful, and that's really almost a cultural assumption. We've seen so many movies and television programs in which this all happens, and you get some kind of information, and the sense was, again, that it wasn't a matter of rendering justice. It was the problem was protecting the United States. And people in the FBI, and in other words, in the law enforcement community, were really weak on this because they were constrained by habits over the years of protecting rights, and that wasn't really what was called for in this time. We were seeking to get the intelligence immediately that could be used in combat operations in the immediate fortune. So it was a very short-term view of the decision. The individuals were narrowly focused on obtaining actionable intelligence, consciously disregarding the broader consequences of their actions and how it could affect the U.S. national interest more broadly defined, which should have been the way this issue was addressed.
When, David, you were talking about turning them into non-humans, I was thinking about how I'd always thought of the men, seeing those pictures of them hooded, as being torment to them, of course. But now I also see that one of the effects of that is to make non-humans of them to the soldiers who are guarding them. If you can't see people's faces, if you make them all look the same, you turn them into sheep or cows or something, you say these aren't human, so it had a double aspect to it that I hadn't recognized before. But what?
I want to address that because there was a very conscious dehumanization going on at Guantánamo. For example, detainees were assigned a number. I mean, this is eerily reminiscent of concentration camps. They were assigned a number. They were referred to by their ISN, their internee serial number. The guards and all the Guantánamo personnel their name tags were removed and they were replaced. You know, the military people have a Velcro name tag, so they were removed and they were replaced with nicknames or code names, and that was theoretically for force protection. So we didn't want their names getting out, but it had the effect of dehumanizing both the guards and the detainees.
That also brings to mind, the use of frequent flyer, for instance, and other kind of trivializing terms. I would hope that people writing about these things did not use those terms. I think using the fuller term is more cruel. I mean, the term represents what it is rather than saying something like frequent flyer, which is clever and euphemistic, obviously. But my question to you, David, is Vandeveld tried, as a prosecutor, was trying all the time to get information. He even flew to Afghanistan, right, to get information, to see the marketplace where this was, where Jawad was supposed to have done this and so on. And he was, at all moments, he was stopped. He couldn't get the information he wanted. Who was giving those orders not to give him information? How was that happening?
I'm not sure that there were specific orders not to give information, but unfortunately, what happened is that when President Bush initially announced that we were going to try detainees in military commissions, the system that he set up with an executive order was so foreign to any notion of American justice and so violative of international civilized standards of justice that it was challenged by a military defense council, and who took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed. That whole process took 4 years. And then Congress passed a new statute, the Military Commissions Act, and then in 2006 it took another year for the implementing regulations to be done. So by the time that they're really getting serious and spinning up the military commissions and trying to figure out who they're going to prosecute, 5 years have passed. And the evidence had disappeared, witnesses had disappeared, you would have to conduct your investigation in a active war zone. So it makes it very, very difficult. And so what he was told initially was, hey, this guy threw a hand grenade, we've got an eyewitness, we've got a confession, this is a slam dunk. And as he delved into it, for example, there was an interrogation by the United States where he had allegedly confessed that had been videotaped. But when we went to look for the videotape, it was gone. And the interrogators who had produced that confession suddenly had amnesia, couldn't remember what happened. It was a long time ago. We interrogated a lot of people. And so, the case fell apart. So I don't know that there was, active obstructionism, but the consequence of the moving away from the rule of law at the very beginning, the decision to authorize torture and enhance, abuse from the beginning, and to not apply the Geneva Conventions and to not apply the rule of law, had this ripple effect that continues to reverberate to this day. That's why we have not been able to try the 9/11 co-conspirators, and we're 12 years later, and we know who they are. We know what they did, but because we tortured them and because of the system that we set up initially, that set us back a decade and delayed justice for the victims of that attack and all the other terrorist attacks. So it has really hurt us in so many different ways.
Could I bring up another thing? In reading about this, I understood that many of those torture techniques were derived from this SIRA program, which was a program designed by the American military to train American soldiers to resist interrogation methods of enemy countries. And those were exercises, were based on the methods of Chinese or Soviet interrogators. So that then the outside contractors, Mitchell and Jessen, who, they developed techniques for interrogation based on their experiences. They were part of the Syria program. And then they trained the CIA interrogators, and then there was a forced drift, and it spread all over the military. But the implication of it is, if I understand correctly, is that because Soviet and Chinese interrogators were not necessarily looking for the truth or even intelligence, but rather, to a large extent at the very least, those techniques were designed to produce false confessions. So they could be used for propaganda services, but also because of the logic of such regimes requires such confessions, that the force drift, as it were, carried these methods to the point in Guantánamo and elsewhere that the only thing that was produced were false confessions. Or not the only thing, perhaps, I have no idea, but that false confessions dominated whatever was received from the detainees.
I think this raises the point why it's so important that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence 6,000-page report on CIA interrogations be made available to the public, because there's a massive amount of data. Just even David's discussion of one case just reveals the data in the interrogation of one person. Now, the Senate has done a comprehensive review of the totality of this using classified documents as well as testimony from individuals. That's likely to be the authoritative explanation of what we did and what happened, whether it was effective or not effective, whether it hurt us or not. Of course, there's a controversy now whether or not it's going to be released. The big debate in Washington on this point. My view is that for the American public to understand what happened, that report has to be released so we can all read it and then judge these facts and these consequences ourselves.
And I think it is important for the American people to understand how these techniques came to be used. But what I don't like to get into is this debate over whether the techniques were effective, whether they produced any intelligence, whether they might have gotten that intelligence by using other techniques instead, because that misses the point, which is these techniques were illegal. They were barred, they were banned, they were violated treaties that we had signed, they violated universal norms, and so it just doesn't matter whether it might work or it did work. You're not allowed to do it. And if the United States signs a treaty and says, we constantly talk about the rule of law and how we're going to export the rule of law to other countries. If we don't follow it here, how can we expect other countries to follow it? And how can we maintain the moral high ground? So that's...
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I mean, when you think about it, our purpose as a nation is to protect human dignity through the rule of law. I mean, you can almost summarize the American experience and experiment in that kind of phrase. And when you think about it, our foreign policy also seeks to accomplish the same sort of goal. We seek to contribute to a world in which human dignity is protected through the rule of law and democracy. And when you think about the impact of cruelty, if the United States today, the position, as we did during the Bush administration, that the right to be free from cruelty is not an individual right. No, it used to be perhaps at one point, but it's no longer an individual right. It's a matter of a state's discretion or the state's act of grace whether or not to treat you with cruelty or not. And if you take it away from the ambit of personal rights and put it in the realm of policy, then all of a sudden the whole edifice of what we understand to be our constitutional rights and the human rights, the edifice of human rights crumbles, because this is absolutely the most fundamental right, the one to be free from cruelty and free from government-sponsored cruelty. If we're now to authorize governments to do this, either by changing our definitions of cruelty, changing our definitions of torture, failing to hold people accountable, we blow a huge hole in the whole architecture of constitutional rights and human rights. And that's the consequence of this debate. And this is why it's still active, because these issues have not been resolved in our country, and the necessary precedential effects of our actions have not been resolved in the international community.
I wanted to ask you each, not about the actions of others, but about your own actions in this context. And about, in particular, the decision to write something down, to record, to go public. Could you each talk a little bit about how you came to that point? Was it a last resort? Was it a matter simply of professional ethics and doing your job? Or how did it come that we're able to read what you did in the course of your jobs here?
Go ahead.
for me, it's a combination of all of these. As a lawyer with responsibilities, you have an obligation to document it. Now, it's important to recognize that, and I've been in government various times, and early on in my career, it became evident to me that there is a practice in government, as there is in a lot of institutions, actually, but certainly in government, that for some key discussions and decisions, maybe not decisions, but for some key discussions, you don't document it. The fear of leaks is such that you always understand the potential consequences of writing something down and what would happen if it were to be circulated beyond where you intended to be circulated. So a lot of what happens in government is done orally. Now, in government, there is a lot of documentation as well, but the suggestion here is that there's a lot of stuff that happened that was not documented either out of this desire for preservation. In my sense, I had reached the point, as I mentioned earlier, where I felt I could no longer ethically or morally continue to handle the matter verbally. I needed to write a document and document my position, put it in the record. That was my first major memorandum, but now my second one was a very lengthy memorandum. After Abu Ghraib, I was certain that, as in fact the investigations were starting, and I needed to develop a comprehensive chronological record of all my activities from start to finish to inform the Inspector Generals and anybody else who might be looking into the activities of government officials during this period.
I was Mohammed Jawad's defense counsel, so obviously I had a duty to defend him zealously, defend him vigorously, but how was I going to go about doing that? And that didn't necessarily require me to speak out in a very public way. Didn't require me to publish my comments or to go to the media. It really could have been done very quietly. And in fact, the transcript of his case has never been released because it never went to trial. And but I felt a couple of things. One, I felt it was very important to establish a historical record of what had taken place. And to correct misperceptions. There is these widespread perception that everyone at Guantanamo is a terrorist. That's just simply not true. The Bush administration themselves let 3/4 of the detainees go because they weren't terrorists. And even today, half of the detainees at Guantanamo have been cleared for release by an interagency task force that determined that they represent no threat to the U.S. or our allies, and yet they are stuck there. So I wanted to show that, I also want to show that there was a big lie, that the claim that we did not torture was not true, and the second big lie that, okay, well, maybe we torture, but we only torture people who have critical intelligence. We're only doing this in situations where we can save lives, people who know of impending attacks. That wasn't true either. Mohammed Jawad knew nothing. He had no intelligence value whatsoever, but they abused him as well, and it was widespread and systemic. I felt it was important to create an historical record of that. I wanted, and you have to remember when this was taking place. It was summer of 2008. We were in the midst of a very heated presidential campaign. And I was trying to have an impact on that because then candidate Obama said he was going to stop the military commissions and he was going to shut down Guantanamo. And I wanted to help him with those goals, and by exposing that we were trying a child soldier who had been tortured for a war crime that wasn't even a war crime, I thought that would give him a little bit of momentum. And it's to my very great disappointment that even though he won, he reneged on those pledges and has kept Guantanamo open and has embraced the military commissions and has embraced indefinite detention. So even though he did disavow torture and other abusive techniques, he has refused to investigate in any real way or hold accountable anyone for the events of that time frame. But it was my hope that by creating an historical record that at least someday there might be some justice not only for Mohammed Jawad but for everyone that was involved in this process.
Can I say something about writing, when reading about this whole issue, Kafka came to mind for obvious reasons. But even it's, you know, it's almost a cliche to talk something like this Kafkaesque. However, there's more closer. It was a closer relationship, I think. You know, the original. It occurred to me the original name of the trial is Die Process, and in reading documents and you know, Larry's book about torture and quoting a lot of documents, the word procedure comes again and again and again, and the logic, which I had mentioned before, that the procedure that justifies itself by proceeding, it's all in Die Process, in the trial already, and also the detainees or the accused in Joseph K. He has no idea what is going on. There are all these random events that he's subject to, has no access to documents. His lawyers have no idea what's going on, and there are all these you know, absurd notions that are perpetuated until they become the law. And of course, on the one hand, I use this framework to understand what is going on. And I think we as a society and people who participate in this larger human culture, we receive epistemological framework from literature, from fiction, from, you know, the general human activities we know as art. So to understand this, I apply the Kafka model, as it were. But it's also possible that Kafka, in some ways, inspired some of these techniques, as it were. That he opened up the eyes of some of you know, unknown government officials way back when, in the 20s or 30s, God knows where. And that his writing, in other words, I like to think that his writing, it's not just a document, but provides an intellectual epistemological framework for us to understand what's happened. But I guess it enhances, to abuse the word again, enhances the power of literature if I try to imagine that somehow his ideas affected even the bad guys, as it were. There's another novel that crossed my mind, The Fixer, by Bernard Malamud, in which, you know, a Jew is imprisoned in 1911 in what is then Russia for, you know, blood libel, and then much of these processes go on: the false confession, accepting the hopelessness of his situation, offering, you know, false hope in, and then withdrawing it, and so on. So for me to read this as an outsider, but as a writer and also as a reader, these are the models that I had to apply. I had no legal training. I have no, you know, I did not know the history of interrogation. And so the power of writing then extends beyond just documenting down, but it extends into the realm of imagination, which is what we have literature for, which is why we're talking about this at a PEN conference rather than, you know, CBC.
At this moment, we all decided beforehand that we would turn to the audience to ask questions, and so now it's your chance, Gal.
Are we going to use this mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you want to ask questions, you can step up over here and.
Hi, I wanted to thank you. I think when the article came out, the first article came out in Slate, I was almost worried that my own capacity for outrage had been exhausted. And first of all, thank you for showing me that that's not the case. And as I was listening to you, I was sort of trying to date the moment when that happened, like when I felt like outrage was useless. And it really does go back to Iraq and to this drumbeat toward war that took place then. There was a lot of very smart people and a lot of very powerful people in the United States, at the United Nations, in Western Europe, knew that this was a terrible idea, that it had nothing to do with what happened at 9/11, that it would be a humanitarian disaster, it would go on forever, and we sort of see the consequences in Iraq today. And I'm sort of wondering whether we can I think also what happened destroyed the power of public opinion. It proved that the media could be manipulated. Some very, very powerful media outlets favored the war with false articles that came out. I mean, I don't think that I need to go into all of the details about this because we're all quite familiar with it. But I'm wondering whether we can also sort of look at this in that same framework within this sort of a drive to a kind of unilateral, this sort of unilateral war, this unilateral attack was also a unilateral attack on our justice system.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into Iraq too much. I'm certainly not an expert on it, but I think what I would say is this notion that I discussed earlier of not valuing human lives of others, and the ultimate devaluation of human life is a decision to go to war. That should be an absolute last resort. It always is going to result in incredible suffering and loss. So the same people that were making the decisions to torture people were also making decisions to go to war on very flimsy or even fabricated evidence. And I think that, so in that way you can tie those two ideas together.
And I'll add one thing about that. I'm also not an expert on Iraq, but it's important for me to share one important insight into this thing from my position within the Pentagon, because I received all kinds of briefings on the suspected weapons of mass destruction programs in Iraq before and after the invasion. And I will just tell you that the uniform belief in the Pentagon was that those weapons existed and they would be found. And one can't underestimate the power of the belief that Saddam was working on weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. And the feeling was genuinely that post 9/11, with a madman like Saddam in control of those kinds of weapons, this was a risk that the United States was no longer willing to take. I say this because there is a strain of thought that believes the Bush administration lied about the weapons of mass destruction. We know there was a massive, irresponsible intelligence failure. And separate from the decision to go to war, which we know separately, regardless of weapons of mass destruction, was destructive and has generated not only the loss of life, but almost $2 to $3 trillion worth of expenditure and astonishing dislocations in the Middle East. So it was clearly a mistake. But there was the belief that the weapons were there and would be found after the invasion.
Thank you very much for being here. In the context of the recent media coverage of the hunger strikes in Guantánamo Bay, it's become part of our mainstream conversation once again. I wonder if, with your more firsthand experience of that place, if you could talk about your thoughts on the potentials of the closing of Guantánamo Bay. And secondly, for better or worse, it's become Guantánamo Bay and the abuses there have become our standard definition or our standard example of abusive practices by this government. I wonder, with your perspectives, if you would point our attention to any other less prominent or less covered examples that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Sure. Well, in my opinion, the worst abuses, I mean, I don't know exactly what went on at CIA secret ghost facilities, but in terms of Department of Defense facilities, the worst abuses were actually at Bagram prison in Afghanistan, even worse than at Guantanamo. And I would recommend for your viewing the film The Taxi to the Dark Side. We beat prisoners, innocent prisoners, to death. American soldiers beat detainees to death at Bagram prison. And that was going on in December 2002, at the time that Mohammed Jawad, my client, was there, and they were threatening. The detainees knew that other people had been beaten to death, and so that's something that has not gotten the attention it deserved. In terms of the hunger strike, I have some thoughts. First of all, I think it is a gross violation of human rights to force feed the detainees. They have very little power in their lives, very few decisions that they get to make, but it certainly should be one of them whether they eat or not, and whether and if they they make a conscious decision as a political protest, a form of expression, not to eat, to protest their indefinite detention. I think that's something that should be respected, and that is certainly the way that medical professionals and the World Medical Association, the American Medical Association view this. As I mentioned before, half of the detainees have been cleared for release, and the reason that they cannot go home is because Congress has passed a series of very stringent legislative restrictions that prohibit detainees from being transferred to the United States, from being transferred to third countries, even from being brought to the U.S. for prosecution. So the only options that the president has is to try them in military commissions or indefinite detention. Now there is a waiver provision where the Secretary of Defense could waive the restrictions in an individual case, but I believe that that waiver is really a setup. That is, because if the Secretary of Defense says in an individual case that it is in the interest of national security to release this individual, and does that, for a number of individuals, and if even one of those detainees engages in any kind of jihadist activity, it is guaranteed to blow up in the President's face and the Secretary of Defense's face, and I almost feel that that is what those who oppose the closure of Guantanamo are hoping will happen. So I have suggested that the administration could simply go into federal court and say that we no longer consider this group of detainees to be detainable under the law of war because they no longer pose a threat, and we do not oppose their habeas corpus petitions, and ask for a court order for them to be released because there is an exception to these restrictions if there is a court order. One little known fact: the Obama administration, the Justice Department, has opposed the habeas corpus petitions of 8 detainees who were on the cleared list. In 3 cases, the detainees won their habeas corpus petition at the trial level. So the Obama administration decides this is a person who doesn't pose a threat and should be released. They oppose their request for release, but they win anyway. And they appealed that ruling. They didn't have to appeal. And those releases were blocked. And tragically, one of those detainees became so despondent that he committed suicide, Adnan Latif. So things have gotten very, very bad there, and America just looks horrible, and it's a disgrace.
Yeah, I agree entirely with David's analysis of this thing. I think Guantanamo needs to be closed down. Justice needs to be applied to the varying categories of detainees in varying different ways. By closing Guantanamo down, we don't really want a change of scenery, because if Guantanamo were just simply to be closed down and then the prisoners transferred to Illinois, for example, you're likely to see a repeat sooner or later of the exact same situation. It's important for the nation to contemplate the damage to our national interest if some of these hunger strikers were to die, and then the image, which is already widespread about Guantanamo being a symbol or symbolic of American injustice, be then augmented in a much more powerful way. When I was at the Pentagon, I had general rank officers who worked on the Joint Staff who told me that the number 1 and number 2 identifiable causes of U.S. combat deaths in Iraq were number 1, Abu Ghraib, and number 2, Guantanamo, because these symbols were used to recruit jihadist fighters into combat against the United States, and this was known by the U.S. military at the time. Guantanamo continues to have that symbolic power of generating opposition and enmity against the United States. So we consider the war on terror continuing or potentially continuing in various different countries. We can't neglect the emotive and symbolic power of Guantanamo, such as it is, in having that kind of negative effect against the United States.
I have a question. You brought up accountability in the discussion, and it had always seemed to me that, reading about the topic over the last decade, that, somebody in Washington gives an order, and then somebody in Guantanamo or Bagram, Kandahar gets hurt, is tortured, or ends up dead in some cases. Will will a president or a politician or anyone in government ever take the steps to hold those accountable for what we've done to these prisoners? Thanks.
Well, so far our record on this is very, very poor, and I think President Obama set exactly the wrong tone right off the bat with his decision that we were going to look forward and not look back. I think he blatantly ignored his legal obligation under the Convention Against Torture, which is that he must investigate and he must prosecute. And, you know, in a sense, he is acting lawlessly by refusing to do that, or you know, not directing the Justice Department to really pursue those things seriously. It is true that the lawyers of the Bush administration, the John Yoo and Jay Bybee and others of David Addington, created this series of opinions that were designed to provide legal cover for the people who carried out the torture. And they made it very difficult to prosecute those people. And they made it difficult to prosecute the senior officials above them because they could say, well, you know, we're not lawyers, we relied on the advice of our lawyers. Even though, in my opinion, they were telling the lawyers, or the lawyers knew exactly the result that they were hoping to get and simply, you know, drafted the opinions accordingly. But so there are real challenges to achieving accountability. I do not think currently there is any political will to do that. Possibly the release of this 6,000-page report might generate some additional momentum towards that, but I don't see it happening very soon. I think there could be pressure coming from some of our allies. There could be investigations that start up in the countries where some of these ghost prisons were, for example, and they release information and they prosecute some people, and then, you know, it could spread in that way, because there is a worldwide movement towards accountability for human rights abuses. We've seen that with the growth of international tribunals and so forth. So maybe someday, in what form, Truth Commission, you know, it's hard to know. But I'm not going to give up until that day comes.
I have a thought about accountability too that I'd like to add, which is, you know, the international law and U.S. law prohibiting torture is unambiguous about what it has to happen when torture happens. Two things must follow from discoveries of torture. Those who tortured must be prosecuted. Those who were tortured must receive restitution for their injuries. That is what the law says. It's clear that we tortured people. We have no choice but to do this. If we don't do it, we stand outside of the international norms that we promoted. That's one thing. But on the personal side, I think if you look at David and Darrel, whose story we hear, and Alberto and the many people like them, when they did the courageous things that they did, the things that they wrote always contain a prophecy of sorts. Someday there's going to be hearings. Someday there's going to be a prosecution. The things we're doing now are going to result in congressional hearings. People are going to be prosecuted. They had this confidence in us. Now we're here. It's our responsibility to reward that confidence. They're the ones who upheld our values. If we don't do that, if we leave people who took that step in the cold, how can we expect people to do the right thing in the future? And I think that's a really, really important human side of this story and why accountability is important. Because like I say, again and again in the documents, the people who documented these things said they documented because they fully expected those documents would go into court proceedings. The FBI had war crimes files that they opened in Guantánamo to keep records. They were waiting for us to do our job, and it's simply our job to do this.
I think that the battle that we are all trying to fight, which is to restore the sense of what our country stands for, which has to do with human dignity through the rule of law, has faded quite substantially because of all of the things that you're describing and that you were witness to. And my major question is, once we recognize, for example, the film Zero Dark 30, which has changed the discourse on torture from the ticking bomb scenario to is torture justified if 1,000 detainees are tortured, maybe they'll give some clues that 10 years later might be useful for something. That's how the discourse has changed, and the American people seem to support that use of torture. We've lost so much ground in what is right, what we stand for, what our basic principles are. How do we begin to restore a sense for the civic discourse that torture is wrong and that we have to rejoin, the world in believing so?
Well, I think it's not enough to say, well, we're going to restore the rule of law, and we're going to do that by not torturing anymore. I think there has to be accountability. We can't, because otherwise, and the Republicans were very good at twisting the debate to say, look, this was just a difference of policy. You have one policy, we had another policy. We don't want to criminalize differences in mere policy, and that went by largely unremarked. And I always wanted to scream, no, we're not criminalizing policy. We're criminalizing crime. It's already a crime. It's a crime to torture people, and you can't do nothing about it. And so I think it's absolutely key to stand up and say, well, it's not American, it's wrong, we're not going to do it anymore. And the people who did it knew better, they knew it was wrong, and we're going to go after them.
Can I ask you one question, Alberto? This goes to accountability. You said that Rumsfeld, after signing this thing, saying that we're stopping cruel treatment, you said that then you realized that it went on. So in terms of accountability, was this all done in secret? Did he just orally say this to people? Is there no document that says after he wrote a document, signed a document saying, no, we're not doing it anymore, it continued?
Yes, then I'm not sure what the answer is. There was a lot of secrecy involved, even within the government. For example, we don't know precisely how the Guantánamo techniques migrated to Bagram and to Abu Ghraib, for example. The so-called Gitmoization of Abu Ghraib, the mechanisms for that aren't particularly clear. So yes, that secrecy does exist. But to the question, if I could go back to the question, part of it is refocusing the national debate. I mean, it's the American people have been focused on whether we got some intelligence from a detainee using any kind of technique and whether that could have led to a military operation. The debate is actually much broader, or should be much broader than that. It brings to mind an observation by Camus that any nation fighting for its values has to take care not to adopt as weapons of wars those weapons that would destroy the values you're seeking to protect. When you think about the national strategic interests, what is our strategic defensive interest as a nation? We have two interests. One is to protect our people and our territory. These are protecting the lives. But the second one is protecting our values. And so when we frame our military intelligence, other kinds of responses to these kinds of challenges, the answer always has to be, are we protecting people? Are we protecting values? And in this case, the use of cruelty or torture as a weapon of war destroys our values. It's contrary to the strategic interest today and over the long arc of history. We're seeking to build a system that prohibits torture, doesn't encourage it, doesn't justify it and introduce non-accountability for its use. It's contrary to the deepest interest. And it may require us to take maybe a measure of additional risk. I would challenge that, but we do so because we're resilient and we take risk in the protection of our values. And that's what the American people needs to understand more clearly.
Can I say something? You have? I think there's been a failure of imagination in relation to these fantasies of force that constantly perpetuated, both in popular culture and any kind of culture, but also this projection of force that the Bush administration and many other administrations, for that matter, perpetuated. That is, we had to show that we are the strongest one, and whether it's a 16-year-old boy or a country that needs to be invaded. And I've been noticing, I'm sure everyone has noticed, the entry of torture into mainstream, from TV shows to Zero Dark 30 to torture porn, like the Saw movies series, where torture was, it was on the fringes, and then it wasn't. And one wonders why that is the case, because there's an audience for this. I mean, paying audience to go to see those movies, never mind people who, were actually proud that we are so powerful in the world. And it has to do something with, conceiving of a nation, not around values, but around power, or thinking of being part of a nation, being a member of a nation, being a citizen, as part of this power structure, so that we are all infused with this power. Bush had 91% approval rate after around the time of Iraq invasion. I mean, I was 9% at the time, but however you bend it, some of us had to flip at some point. There was an excitement about projecting this power. We're going to kick ass. And there was this excitement. To some extent, it's understandable. To some extent, it's unjustifiable. And torture is continuous with this, in my mind. And this is something that the national discourse, national conversation, and then expansion of imaginative field, as it were, beyond violence and force as the main means of agency, it needs to happen. I don't know a novel, the magnitude of The Fixer, let alone The Trial, that is dealing with what happened to us with this torture, to all of us. We all, not so much complicit in it, but we all touched by it, right? It did something to us as American citizens. It is demeaning, it has been demeaning since it started.
Unfortunately, we have to stop this panel now. So Larry, Sasha, David, Antonio, thank you very much.